So we're back to continue talking about our relatedness to all of the animals and our animal ancestor. As we've been talking about, there's lots and lots of different lines of evidence for this. The physical, we could talk about behavioral. In the last lecture, we were talking about the molecular or genetic relatedness, especially with the sonic hedgehog gene that regulates the development of the limbs and limb growth. So the hope here is for everybody to think about the potential of this information or this knowledge. If we understand how limbs grow and develop, can we use that to benefit humans? So I want you guys to think about this for a moment. If a lizard has its tail broken off, what happens? Hopefully you thought about it and said, well, they can regrow their tail. So think about that. That lizard, that limb is regrowing bone, muscle, nerve, skin, blood vessels, all those tissues are regenerating. How? There's something in the genetics that we don't understand, but something in the genetics of that animal that enables it to do that. Now, if a person loses a limb, why can't we regenerate? Is it a gene we don't have? Or is it a gene that's been turned off through evolution? So this is the hope that we look at the potential. This is why I want this hopefully to be relevant to say, okay, hopefully nobody listening to this and watching these lectures has ever suffered the loss of a limb, but do you know somebody who has? Think about all the soldiers in the military who've gone to combat and who've come back injured, missing a leg, a foot, a hand, an arm, unfortunately, whatever. Can we use this knowledge to benefit those people? That's the relevancy side of this course I want you guys to continue to look at, is how can we apply this knowledge and make human life better? Okay, so we were talking about limb growth and limb development, and it didn't just start with the amphibians. As I mentioned earlier, fish have limbs. There's a special group of fish called the lobe-finned fish. They're still alive today. We have them in the oceans, walking around today. So take a look at their fin structure. If you really, is it really a fin when it has a pelvis bone, a femur, a tibia, a fibula? Those are the exact same bones in our leg. Our hip structure, we have a pelvis, and then we have the femur, that's your big leg bone, and then the tibia and the fibula, what we call the shin bone, and the bone of the lower leg here. Go up into the shoulder. Oh, there's the shoulder joint, and then a humerus, an ulna, a radius. Same bone structures found in these fish. Those fish, some of those fish gave rise to those early ancestral amphibians we were talking about. And then we talked about and looked at again, I apologize, I can't come up with a good description, the squished, flattened, whatever, amphibian that we discussed in the previous lecture, the Tiktaalik rosea, that, half fish, half amphibian, fishapod, the in-between stage. So how many more of those are out there? That's what we want to keep discovering with more science, more research. So we talked about how science works through the scientific method. You make an observation, you develop a hypothesis, you run design your experiment, collect your data, etc. So imagine this hypothesis. Amphibians are descended from fish. Do we have data that supports that hypothesis? Well, let's look at molecular data. Yes, it shows a relatedness. Let's look at anatomical data. shows relatedness. Let's look at fossil data, shows relatedness. So all these lines of evidence support that hypothesis. This is why we can say amphibians came from a fish ancestor. And then we can do the same thing with the next group. Let's talk about reptiles. Do reptiles have an amphibian ancestor? And we do the same thing. We look for lines of evidence. We test, we experiment, we collect data. Yes, it's supported. And then we go to the next group and so on. And we just work our way through all these connections. And we can see the relatedness of these animal groups. So it makes it just very, very exciting, very fun to constantly be seeing new information and new evidence coming out. So, all right, so that's the limbs, or those are the limbs that we were talking about. Now, what about the mouth? What about the jaws, the feeding apparatus of animals? Well, when we're talking about this connection to the fish, we look at the evolution of the jaw. Okay, how'd this show up? Where'd this come from? There are some fish out there that we call jawless. If you've ever heard of a lamprey, those guys are jawless fish. Other fish have jaws. But we can look at the jaw evolution process. So early jawless fish, they are chordata, vertebrata. There's their cranium or their skull bone, and then they'd have the backbone coming down this way. And in their, let's call it, mouth region, they had little pieces of bone. Those bones continued to develop and evolve along with the gill slits. And then this gave rise to eventually functional jaws. So think about the difference if you're a fish that eats by suction cup action, like a vacuum hose, or a fish that can bite down and chomp on things. So when we get into evolution and we look at natural selection and what makes things more adaptable, it's features that give them an advantage. And if you have two fish side by side, one is sucking like a vacuum, the other one is biting and crushing, the biting crusher is going to have a wider variety of food choices that increase its likelihood of survival. So something we want to think about, and oh, I'm sorry, wrong button. Not this one. When we talk about evolution and animals, jaws provide so the jaws give a lot of animal species a huge advantage when it comes to feeding. If you can feed easier, you get more food. More food means more energy. More energy increases chances of reproduction, passing on your genetics, etc. All this works out for your benefit when you can have those jaws. All right, so what occurred over a long period of evolutionary time the pharyngeal pouches evolved into the gills in fish. The gill arches are the structures that support the fish. Those are the things that modified into the jaws in the early fish. And those fish we were talking about in the previous slide, these lobe-finned fish, they have a jaw. So now they have that feature, they have these leg features. That moves us again to our amphibians. We go from these guys giving rise to ancestral amphibians. Ancestral amphibians gave rise to the reptiles, reptiles to mammals, and on and on and on. And here we are. So, all right. So, big picture overview. Let me scoot this over. Big picture here. How does all this connect? Oh, don't keep getting the wrong button. When we look at animals and we look at our relatedness, our ancestral relatedness to animals, all right, so millions of years ago, all animals had a common ancestor. That ancestor possessed those 4 key features we talked about. I'm going to put some asterisks here. I'm going to make them red. Yeah, that's important for you guys to know. I'm not going to go back over them. I want you to go back into the lecture and go back over them and say, okay, what were those 4 key features that we talked about with all the animals? What made animals animals? What made them chordata? Let's focus on the chordata. Oh. Okay, so there's our guess important, know it stars again. Okay, so again, I don't want to spoil it. I want you to go back to your notes, pull that out, highlight it, star it, know the chordata key features. So the evolutionary journey is what gave rise to the diversity of animals we have today, all these different groups. So very simplistically, common ancestor gives rise, groups diverge, diversify, traits, new traits appear, other traits dead end. All right, so each of these branches coming off represents different animal groups. As we saw before, this right here might be mammals. Oh, sorry about the writing. It is not easy to do this with the mouse. Okay, this branch right here could be the reptiles. And you say, well, how can reptiles be there if they gave rise to mammals? Well, we're related. We have a common ancestor right here. And then from that ancestral group, we split off. Reptiles continued and diverged and diversified and etc. So remember, time is going like this. So at any given moment in time, if you take a cross section of this, here's all the groups present at that moment in time. Here are the groups present in that moment in time, the next moment in time, and so on. Some groups didn't make it to the next level in time because they went extinct. Others diversified and diverged and evolved and gave us more diversity. But the evolutionary history, the things that are supporting this, we talked about this before, but just to reemphasize, let's look at the molecular data, the DNA. Let's look at the anatomical data, the skeletal structures, the evolution of the jaws. What about those key features that make chordates chordates? All these different traits and features and aspects show all animals are related. So we can learn a tremendous amount about ourselves by studying other animal groups and looking at their evolutionary journey. Can we then take pieces of that and apply it to ourselves? And as I mentioned in that couple slides back, think about the potential if we unlock the genetic information found in these other animal groups. Do we have that same genetic information in us? We just don't recognize it, or it's turned off. Okay? So lots of exciting stuff when we talk about animals. Hopefully, everybody looks at their animals a little bit differently now.